Welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's 11 our time. So I am Jewel Davis, Chair of the North Carolina Library Association's Roundtable for Ethnic Minority Concerns. Welcome to our first webinar in our May Culture Conversation series. So our topic for today focuses on answering what are microaggressions and why do they matter in our workplaces. I am excited to introduce our speaker today, Endia Sowers Paige. Endia is the pre-law advisor at the University of Georgia. She was previously the Outreach and Research Services Librarian at the University of Georgia School of Law. She has also worked as a law librarian at George Mason University, Howard University, and the Law Library of Congress. Endia earned a bachelor's degree from the University of South Carolina and her Master of Library Science and Juris Doctor from North Carolina Central University. She is a member of the Black Caucus of the American Library Association and the Southeastern chapter of the American Association of Law Libraries, where she serves on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Welcome, Ms. Paige.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning for some. I see we have some people from California, I see in the chat. Definitely let us know where you're logging in from. I'm so excited that y'all are here to learn about microaggressions and why they matter in our workplaces. It's a topic that I enjoy presenting about as a person who's passionate about creating inclusive work environments, but also as someone who's been on the receiving end of microaggressions more times than I can count. So I want to say thank you to Jewel Davis for coordinating this event, and also the North Carolina Library Association's Roundtable for Ethnic Minority Concerns for inviting me to present. It really is an honor. I also want to say thank you to all of the librarians who shared the flyer for this event with their colleagues. I saw it circulating on several listservs, so thank you all for that. So my goal for today's presentation is to begin with taking a look at the history of the word microaggressions and look at how that definition has evolved. We'll also transition it into examining the three different categories of microaggressions, and we'll look at examples in each one of those categories. We'll then move into discussing some tips for fostering inclusion in our organizations and also minimizing microaggressions in the workplace, which will include some strategies for how to confront microaggressions. I'll be asking some questions along the way for you to engage with each other in the chat. I may not see all of the comments in real time as I'm balancing some different screens here with my PowerPoint being up, but Jewel's going to be monitoring the chat, and I'll be sure to reserve some time at the end to answer a couple of questions or hear your comments at the end. I know that diversity and inclusion matters, and rather diversity and inclusion matters, and topics like microaggression can be a touchy subject for some. So you don't have to feel pressured to engage in the chat, but I really hope that you will take advantage of it just to add an additional layer to the presentation. Hearing me define a term is one thing, but seeing how a fellow librarian to see how this is played out in their real life can really help to increase the awareness of what this looks like in action. So let's jump right into the history of the word microaggression. So this word was actually coined by Dr. Chester Pierce. Dr. Pierce was a professor at Harvard University. He actually passed away in 2016. But this word dates back to the 1970s when Dr. Pierce used it to describe insults he witnessed non-Black Americans inflict on African Americans. So at the origin of the use of the word, it was focused specifically on Black Americans. There's a story I read about Dr. Pierce that described him playing football at the University of Virginia, where they allowed him to play on the integrated football team, but he wasn't allowed to stay at the same hotel as his teammates. So, these are the kind of experiences that were common during segregation and also heavily impacted Dr. Pierce's research and work as a psychiatrist. The more recent definitions of the term microaggressions, they typically come from the work of Dr. Derald Sue. Dr. Sue is a professor at Columbia University. He's a professor of counseling psychology. And most of the presentations that we're going to work with in this webinar come from Dr. Sue's work. But he added an additional layer to Dr. Pierce's definition to begin to include not only race, but religion, gender, ability, sexual orientation, mental health status. Here are two of Dr. Sue's most popular titles. Have any of you read any of Dr. Sue's books? Let me know in the chat which ones you've read. Some other books by Dr. Sue include, Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence, I know is one, Counseling the Culturally Diverse. So if you've read any of his work or articles written by Dr. Sue, definitely let me know in the chat box. You may also want to check to see if these books are available in your own libraries. So Dr. Sue's definition of microaggressions, they are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. Let's break this down. I guess this is kind of the lawyer in me. I like to break things down element by element. But, you know, first, they're everyday, they're common. Microaggressions are often subtle, just right under the surface and frequently occurring. They can be verbal or nonverbal, so they can be comments or insults, but they can also be, you know, kind of that typical imagery you see of, you know, someone clutching their purse when a black male walks by. They can be environmental. You're seeing a lot more of this in the news and in different protests regarding, you know, buildings named after slave owners or petitions to remove Confederate monuments, those kind of things. Slights, snubs, or insults, again, they don't have to be overt, and they typically aren't overt. And my favorite element, whether intentional or unintentional, I think that sometimes, you know, people mistake something being, well, basically unintentional is not a pass to say whatever you want to say. So I think that's why this is my favorite element. Which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages. And then finally, that target persons solely based on their marginalized group membership. And again, and on building from Dr. Pierce's previous definition, this is now including race, religion, gender, ability, sexual orientation, and mental health status. So this quote from Dr. Sue is from his book, Microaggressions in Everyday Life. And we see here, microaggressions are similar to carbon monoxide, invisible but potentially lethal. Continuous exposure to these types of interactions can be a sort of death by 1,000 cuts to the victim. You know, I've heard the illustration given once of thinking about microaggressions like a paper cut. You know, I don't say this to be dismissive, but just kind of go with me for a minute. So for someone who just gets a paper cut occasionally, it may sting, may not seem like that big of a deal. It's just a paper cut, right? But for those who are constantly getting paper cuts, they may be on their 25th paper cut of the week. It graduates from being merely an annoyance to painful and frustrating, can have a long-lasting effect. And it becomes even more frustrating when someone who rarely gets a paper cut attempts to police your feelings and minimize the fact that even though it's not a big deal in their life, you're now bleeding because, you know, you've been, this is your 50th paper cut. So for you, it is a big deal. So I often get the question too, why are they called microaggressions? Sometimes they feel, you know, like it should be macroaggressions, but it's micro because they're often small, you know, they often occur in private situations, but their effects are often much bigger. So let's go into talking about the different kinds of microaggressions. The first category of microaggressions is a micro assault. So these are much more overt than the other two categories. Some people refer to these as old-fashioned racism or bigotry. So these are intentionally discriminatory actions or assault to a person's identity. They're deliberate. They have the intent to hurt, oppress. Some would say that these aren't as common, but I've also heard, some people make the argument that they've seen an increase since the 2016 election. That's something maybe you all can let me know in the chat. Do you think that there has been an increase in these more overt microaggressions, or is it more of, we now live in a time where everyone has a phone in their hand that can record and post, so we're now just seeing them more, but they were always there. So let me know what you think in the chat if you are willing to share. Some examples of microassaults: racial slurs, denying services or jobs or housing based on race. Again, these very overt actions. Displaying symbols of oppression, Islamophobic comments, say a professor having Islamophobic comments during a lecture. So the next two are much more subtle. Micro insults are they're unconscious communications that convey rudeness, insensitivity, or demean a person's heritage or identity. So context is so important, because sometimes these comments aren't demeaning on their face, but they can have an underlying tone that point to unchecked biases. So the example you see here on the post-it, you don't sound Black. Well, what does Black sound like? Are you basing your expectation of what a Black person should sound like? Are you basing that on stereotypes? So with micro insults, they're often presented as compliments, but don't feel complimentary. If you all can think of any examples of micro insults that you can share in the chat, definitely let me know, especially those that, may appear to be compliments, or even, like we mentioned before, that you can be have the best of intentions but still be inappropriate. And the final category of microaggressions are micro-invalidations. And so these exclude or negate a person's thoughts or feelings. It's basically when the truth of a person's lived experiences, they're denied or ignored, or the psychological effects are nullified. Some examples, well, actually, I'd like to show this example. I don't see color, because it's one that surprises a lot of people. As I mentioned in the previous slides, context is so important, but a lot of times this phrase, while it may come with good intentions, I've seen it often used as a tool to silence. So if someone has come to you and expressed a frustration about, a comment that they found offensive, and your first response is to shut it down and say, I don't see color, and use it as a tool to end the conversation, it can be a problem. And this phrase can also be problematic for some people, because in a lot of people's minds, when they hear I don't see color, they hear you don't see me. We all have biases. Being aware of them, not ignoring them, is what helps us decrease microaggressions in our workplace. Our differences, they allow us to bring different things to the table, and they're an asset. So they don't have to be ignored or dismissed by using this myth of colorblindness. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts about the phrase, I don't see color? A few more examples here. You see the post-it on the left side. This librarian was assigned to search committees because they're the only Latina librarian. This is an example of a micro-invalidation. On the right, you were only admitted to this program because of your race, is a micro-insult. I pulled these post-its from a website called Microaggressions in Librarianship. Definitely check it out if you are interested in. It's described as a space that's aimed to identify, acknowledge, and overcome microaggressions that continue to exist in our profession and that are the real lived experiences of LIS professionals for marginalized communities. So people can go on and post their different experiences. So definitely check that out if you're curious. A few more examples of microaggression. So you speak good English, saying this to, say an Asian American or someone of Asian descent who was raised here, but, a person looks at them and assume that they must not be from here, or they're a foreigner. You people, again, context matters, but a lot of times that is used before an inappropriate comment, kind of clustering groups of people. That's so gay. I'm not racist. I have several Mexican friends. Who is the man or woman in the relationship? Highly inappropriate comment, often directed towards those in the LGBTQIA community. You know, that's crazy. I know that's one that I have made a conscious effort to work on, because those among us who are struggling with mental health challenges, you know, hearing people kind of jokingly throw around the phrase, you know, that's bipolar, that's crazy, or that's insane, it can be really insensitive. Imitating accents. Also, you know, telling a woman that she should smile more in the workplace, or describing a Latina coworker as being spicy when she asserts herself in meetings. All of these are examples of microaggressions and are inappropriate for our workplaces. Let me know in the chat what you think about some of these examples, or if you've heard some of these examples, either directed at you or towards someone else. Okay. I mentioned earlier that you're seeing more mentions of environmental microaggressions in the news, with the different petitions to change mascot names or to remove Confederate statutes, or rather, the lawyer in me said statutes, Confederate statues. This is something that we can be aware of in our libraries as we're thinking about displays, instructional materials. You know, do your displays reflect your patron population? So when being on the receiving end of a microaggression, it's not uncommon to begin this internal dialogue where you're questioning your feelings. You know, what do they mean by that? Should I say something? Am I overreacting? You know, will speaking up make it worse? I want to be sure to say this because there's likely someone on the webinar who has been second guessing themselves about something they've experienced at work. I just want to take a moment to affirm that you're not imagining this, you're not alone in this, and you're not overreacting. So, you know, being able to define microaggressions and use this language matters, because I've talked to so many librarians who appreciate finally having the language to describe something that was already a part of their experiences long before the academic terminology. So why should we call out microaggressions in our workplaces? Why does this matter in our libraries? You know, there's some who may debate me on this one, but I argue that it's simply the right thing to do. You know, creating an environment that has respect for our differences, I think is, you know, not only the right thing to do kind of amongst ourselves in our libraries, amongst colleagues, but also for our patrons, for our students. And I also argue that it kind of helps to uphold our profession. You know, the ALA says that equity, diversity, and inclusion are fundamental values of the association and therefore should also be important to its members. But if that isn't enough of a reason, you know, recruitment. Also, in thinking about our organizational missions, our strategic plans, you know, I'm always happy when I see organizations moving beyond, you know, diversity and inclusion being buzzwords and them actually having, you know, actions and goals to back up, you know, how are you actually helping to usher diversity and inclusion into your organization. Productivity. On this last one, productivity, I saw a study not too long ago. Oh, I wish I'd saved the link so I could share it with you all. But I may find it and add it to the notes. I saw a study that said that voluntary turnover due to unfairness costs US employers more than like $85 billion a year. That's a staggering number. You know, you can let me know in the chat, why do you think confronting microaggressions is so important in our libraries? Dr. Sue has also done some work regarding the lasting impact of microaggressions. Just a quote I'm reading here from him. Microaggressions create a hostile and invalidating climate for people of color, saps their spiritual and psychic energies, and their cumulative nature can result in depression, frustration, anger, rage, anxiety, loss of self-esteem. So he's, this quote, he's specifically mentioning people of color, but of course this applies to, you know, all the groups we mentioned, from gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, ability. Okay, so let's move into some of the tips for minimizing microaggressions as a manager. And I see I'm wanting to present and read the chat. You all are sharing such great comments. I want to read them all, but I'm also trying to balance that with presenting. So keep the comments coming. But some tips for minimizing microaggressions as a manager. The first one is to accept that microaggressions are happening in the workplace. Whether you choose to acknowledge it or not, it's happening. Ideally, as a supervisor, you should be fostering an environment that encourages honest discussion. You know, don't punish people for speaking up. Some more tips for managers. Call out inappropriate behavior. You know, failure to call out inappropriate behavior is one of the biggest morale busters in an organization. Allowing the office bully to go unchecked or even rewarding bad behavior can have a disastrous impact on your staff. You know, if you're not sure how to do this, seek out additional training to help build your confidence in this. But I'm sure, you know, and let me know if you agree in the chat. When a supervisor kind of let certain things go unchecked, it can really decrease the morale. And then acknowledge an occurrence, whether you committed it or witnessed a microaggression. One of the most powerful things I've ever seen a supervisor do, I won't ever forget it, and it has definitely impacted me in the way that I choose to manage, was I witnessed a supervisor who made an inappropriate comment at a weekly staff meeting, and then at the next meeting, at the beginning of the meeting before we started, they apologized for the comment. I'd never seen a supervisor own up to a mistake. It was a mind-blowing moment for me. So, you know, I know it can be tricky to admit or difficult to admit when you've made a mistake, but I assure you, your staff will respect you even more for that. And then again, seek training to build your confidence. I hear the comments a lot, I'm not sure what to say or what to do. You know, we're researchers, we research for a living. Continue to read articles, go to trainings like these, talk to people. Ignorance can't be an excuse. Minimizing microaggressions as an employee. The big one is being aware of your own biases. For those of you who have not taken the implicit association, the implicit bias test, that you can check it out at implicit.harvard.edu. You can go and take the different tests they have, but being aware of your own biases can help you to prevent them translating into action in the workplace. You definitely want to re-examine your library displays, your instructional materials. You know, I know I have a few law librarians also on the webinar. If all of your hypos, if the villain always looks a certain way or has a certain name, you may want to reconsider varying your names, varying your examples and your displays. Consistency in enforcing library policies is a big one. You want to be sure that you are enforcing policies consistently, fairly across all different groups. You aren't enforcing, you know, on one particular group harsher than another. And that you also want to revisit your library policies to make sure that biases have not become a part of the policy. At work, you want to avoid confusing proximity with intimacy. So a lot of times, you know, we spend so much time with our coworkers that it can kind of create this illusion that we may be closer to them than we are. So just because you are around someone for a good portion of your day, that does not mean that you know them well enough to ask them personal questions, you know, to want to have conversations about their reproductive choices or who they're dating and their life outside of work. You just want to be very cautious about that. And then again, as I mentioned with for the managers, you want to research, read, study, engage. I want to briefly mention that I've been reading a lot more about this AdCar model, which is a model for organizational change, starting with awareness and transitioning into desire, knowledge, ability, reinforcement. I encourage you all to look into this a little bit more if you're not as familiar with it, because I'm now in a place where I'm doing some research on seeing how this can apply to making change to create an inclusive work environment. But as I mentioned before, you know, we're all biased beings. We can't completely eliminate giving or receiving microaggressions. We can't make them all disappear, but we can manage them by becoming aware of our biases and learning how to catch them before, you know, certain things come out of our mouth or before those biases become action or policy. So awareness being the first step, which, you know, again, you all are here. I'm glad you all are here. Awareness can help us move from, you know, this idea of the golden rule, which is treating others as you'd want to be treated, to the platinum rule, treat others the way they'd want to be treated. You know, if someone has made it clear that they have preferred pronouns, you know, you need to respect that and use their preferred pronouns as an example. Okay, so how do we confront microaggressions? This can be the tricky piece for some people. So before starting the conversation, you really want to take a moment to assess, you know, what do you want to gain by this? Because that will change how you approach. You know, are you just wanting to verbalize your feelings? But before you begin to confront it, you want to take a breath, pause before proceeding so that you're not responding out of anger. And in this assessment, you're deciding whether you even want to engage. I know there are times when there are times you really just have to do an energy assessment and just, you may be having a not today moment. And also exploring whether you're prepared for any response. If I'm in a place where I know I'm not going to respond well to, you know, them, to anything that were to come out of their mouth, then I may make the decision, I'm not going to confront this one this time. You want to assume no malicious intent unless otherwise shown. Ask follow-up questions. What do you mean by that? Especially for first-time offenses. And then explain your point of view. And listen. A lot of times the most lasting change can come from, you know, someone seeing another person's point of view for the first time. Avoid the temptation to respond with sarcasm or insults. Now, I know some people have, you know, their sarcasm is masterful, you know. So, you know, for those who are able to use sarcasm and humor effectively, by all means, if you've assessed the situation and you see that it would be appropriate and that works for you, then go at it. But I will caution, as far as using humor, sometimes, you know, using humor, you want to be careful not to in any way let the humor somehow diminish what you're sharing. So, you know, if you're comfortable with humor, go for it. But if not, sometimes it's best to just kind of be direct in confronting these. You want to, again, I mentioned before, remember that lasting change often comes from understanding a different perspective. Education is the goal. So tell me, have you all had to confront a microaggression? What was the approach that you used? So I've inserted a few questions that I typically get either in emails after I do these presentations, or people come up to me after presentations at conferences. And the big one is, you know, but what if they deny being offensive? Again, you want to pause, take a moment, decide whether it's worthwhile to you to continue the conversation. But if you do choose to proceed, you want to reiterate that you're not blaming the person, but you are expressing the way that a comment or action made you feel. So what if you're accused of inflicting a microaggression? ideally, and again, this is ideally, you would approach it by listening and try not to be defensive. I know it can be tricky, but try to hear them, because when you go into defense mode, you're not hearing anymore. You want to acknowledge the person's willingness to share their feelings and their experiences, and then apologize and reflect on how you can avoid similar gaps in the future. So you don't always have to agree with a person to respect that person. I also want to note that the best apology is changed behavior. And then another question I get quite a bit, and I know this can vary so much from workplace to workplace, but what if your supervisor is the person who is constantly, inflicting microaggressions? You will likely have to reflect and assess. You're going to have to gauge the situation a little bit more cautiously and thinking about, what's going to be the best approach for that supervisor. Going and talking to them, one-on-one, sending them an email. So kind of do some assessment of the best approach for that supervisor. I've seen it, I think it was pretty rare to say that a supervisor would be open to being called out in a group setting. I'm sure those people exist, but that has not been my experience. I think that either a one-on-one or an email may be a more appropriate approach. But in confronting the behavior, you want to be clear about what you want to accomplish, but also be sure that you document everything. So even if you go to have a one-on-one conversation, send a follow-up email, make note of your interactions with this particular supervisor. And unfortunately, depending on the severity of your current workplace and the negative impact that it's having on your life, there may come a time when you decide to get out. This is not to say that you should be forced out of any job, but sometimes the best decision may be for you to leave. Because, the reality is a toxic job environment will change your idea of normal. And, so you may become so used to it, so desensitized to it, that it may diminish your confidence. You may start to wonder could you get another job? You absolutely could get another job, and your skills can transfer into another position where you are able to thrive. Again, I mentioned, I don't want to see anyone feel that they have to be forced out, but the reality is sometimes you may need to make that assessment for your own health. So I'm actually at the end of my presentation. I wanted to be sure to leave some time for comments. I want to go back and look and see some of the things that you all wrote in the chat. But yeah, I'm open to, have a conversation. Jewel, were there any questions that you saw repeated in the chat box that you want to?
Actually, everyone's been responding to each other and answering each other's questions, so it's been a great discussion at this point. All of the questions that have come up so far.
Oh, great. I see someone define the difference between bias and prejudice. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, it's great. So we'll just see what comes up now. So one just came in. Could you expand on the recruitment portion of calling out microaggressions?
Okay, let's see. Was that the slide where I mentioned the benefits, or is there, I feel like I want a little bit more information, because I could have an entire webinar on my thoughts on improving the recruitment process and some practices that we could do to make that better. But as far as why it's beneficial from a recruitment standpoint to call out microaggressions, let's see.
Kayleen says it was on the slide.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
So our field, I've learned that librarianship is it can be small. I mean, we all begin to know each other really well from presenting together, working together, and conferences. And what I meant by the recruitment mention is because, schools can begin to develop a reputation. I remember I did a kind of a diversity and inclusion chat at a conference last year, where a number of the attendees came specifically to ask me, why weren't more people of color applying to their school? And the reality is that, a library's reputation can precede it. And so that's kind of what I was referring to with the recruitment piece of why it's important to call them out. Because when a person is considering applying for a job, they're going to reach out to a number of people that might know someone at that place or who's worked at that place. And there are several libraries that have developed, reputation for not being the most inclusive spaces. How many of you have done the implicit bias test? I say thank you, Jewel, for sharing the link. Okay. Did you find it to be illuminating? I think what was interesting to me, and I'm a person who I'll kind of share my own experience with the implicit bias testing. I think sometimes, especially as a as a Black woman, I in no way am ignorant to the fact that people within certain groups can still inflict microaggressions or have biases. We all have biases. No one is exempt or immune from having biases. So some of the results were surprising to me. For me in particular, the one that stood out was the one about weight. And I can see how, even though I don't think I have any biases about a person's size, I can see how certain seeds were planted all throughout my life that would kind of create a bias or preference towards a person appearing to be more fit or healthy. So I know that test was really, really illuminating for me.
So there was a question that came in a little bit before saying that she'd heard about a checklist to minimize bias when helping library customers. Does anyone use something like that now? And to expand on that, do you have any additional resources that you can suggest to help people get started in thinking about and minimizing their bias?
I do. I'm actually working on, because I've done this presentation or versions of this presentation for a while now, and I'm now working on a LibGuide of sorts, a resource that I want to begin sharing with those who attend that have additional readings, articles, videos. And so that is a work in progress, and I promise to send that to Jewel as soon as it's done. And share that to everyone who was a part of the webinar today. Because I'm very big on, there has to be a now what. We can sit in the webinars and I think it's great, but as far as actually taking this back into our libraries and having some tools to begin working through the steps to minimize bias and microaggressions. So would that be okay, Jewel? Everyone that signed up, we have an email list, correct? And I can.
Yes, absolutely. I'll send it through to everyone.
I saw something about microaggressions and customers.
Yes, there was
patrons.
Emily Mann. What can we do regarding microaggressions from patrons?
So I definitely have a few examples of this that I've experienced at the reference desk. And I know in my decision and how to confront it, it has varied depending on, the reality of it, when people are on the receiving end of these quite a bit, there's a certain, you have to assess your energy level, because sometimes it's just, you just can't do it on a particular day. But on the days when I'm willing to engage, I ask a follow-up question, like I think about the gentleman who asked, you know, I have a really hard legal research question. Is there a man available who can help me? You know, I begin to ask him some follow-up questions until we ultimately got to him recognizing that I was the person who was to help him. The story is a little bit longer than that. It actually involved a coworker stepping in who redirected him back to me, but you know, that's a conversation for another day. But as far as patrons, I'm curious about, I see some people are sharing about their interactions with patrons. I thought I saw something. Patrons are a little bit tougher because you don't necessarily have any, you don't have any way to correct them beyond banning them from services. If a person is just a continuous offender. So I know it can definitely be much more tricky to confront this with patrons. I'm a big fan of the follow-up question because sometimes even just taking that moment to make a person have to think and repeat what they said, like they'll catch it a lot of times. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, I'm kind of scrolling through.
So there is another question. I had a toxic supervisor that I had to leave. Now I have a supervisee that is accusing me of the same. Sadly, the behavior is unconscious and quite probably associated with my diagnosis. Still, I have apologized. What is the next step?
You've apologized to the to your supervisee? And
she said yes.
Okay. So, and talk to me a little bit more about, I guess, with this being ongoing, what has happened since the apology? See if I missed that. Are they still continuing to say that you've been offensive, or have they not been able to release one particular incident? Because of course the best apology I mentioned before is change behavior, but it sounds like you've apologized and you're attempting to move on and they're not as willing. Yeah, I do see the, okay. Yeah, I'm wondering if we should talk about, if you can email me about that one. So I have some thoughts, but let's email me at epage@uga.edu. epage@uga.edu. Thank you for that reminder too, Carol. As I mentioned before, our field is incredibly small.
If you're open to taking more questions, there's another, when is it appropriate to bring in HR as a manager or as an employee?
Oh, goodness. Oh, epage@uga.edu. When to bring in HR? Some organizations have policies that specifically outline when it's appropriate to bring in HR. I usually go the route of, there's been a first incident, it was addressed, it wasn't corrected, and there was a second incident, confronted, wasn't addressed. I kind of have a 3 strikes you're out approach. I don't know if that's the best way to word it, but I know that, certain organizations have very specific policies about documenting these kind of interactions, and they may want to intervene sooner to have kind of some mediation. I see someone says we don't have an HR department. Oh, wow. That definitely is tricky. I hope that not having an HR department, do people kind of self-govern? Or is there like a unified policy within the library that governs? Okay, we just take it. Okay, we just take it and smile. Wow. I saw someone ask if this chat will be available later for people to watch again.
Yes.
I know it's being recorded. Okay.
Yes, I'll save the chat transcript as well and include that within the listing of resources. This has been a great conversation.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed presenting and talking to you all today. And like I said, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Oh, I see I have my email right up. It's epaige@uga.edu. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Endia. We thoroughly appreciate you taking the time to help us learn. So we just want to thank you from our association. And thank you everyone for participating. You will receive an email with resources in the next few days. And hopefully you can join us in some of our other events. So thank you all for coming.